An important point in what you have described as the arc of history. I sometimes call it the river of history. The first and foremost thing is we need to recognize that this is an important moment. It's a critical moment, a crucial moment for our country and everything that we've tried to make our country stand for over the years.
Welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, BPL President and host for this new virtual series that we're kicking off tonight. Part of the library's mission is to support lifelong learning, education, and civic engagement, free to all. We do this by offering engaging programs, bringing leading and interesting figures and experts of note into conversation and dialogue. Tonight's program launches this new mini-series under our Contested Perspectives theme, informed by historical moments and movements, recent and past. It is titled The Arc of History, Contested Perspectives. And now please get ready to join me in welcoming our guest for the evening. He is a joint Peabody and Emmy-award winning journalist. A recent book is Rather Outspoken, with a famed and storied career that has spanned more than 6 decades. Dan Rather brings his unique perspective to world events, the major issues of our time. His vast knowledge of subjects ranging from politics, government, world affairs, the economy, and the state of the media, to reflections on our national character, the importance of the common good, citizenship, and the most provocative and disturbing issues making headlines today. We will be reflecting in our conversation on several of these topics, both past and current. Dan, welcome. Thank you for being willing to join us in this experiment and for kicking off our new series. How are you doing tonight? And I now understand that you are back home with your family.
Yes, David, I am back home in Austin, Texas with my family, where we have one of our homes. My work is centered in New York City, and I was quarantined, very strictly quarantined, self-quarantined there for 2.5 months, separated from Jean, but I was able to rejoin Jean, my wife of 63 years, here in Texas very recently. So I am coming to you live and direct from beautiful downtown Austin, Texas, where we have an apartment. But I will confess to you, because I think it's necessary, that I pride myself on not getting nervous with television and public appearances, but I'm a little nervous about this thing tonight. I have not done this kind of appearance virtually, so to speak. But I do want to say that I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I'm honored by the opportunity to be with you. And I say hello to the audience, and I appreciate their being there, and will appreciate their indulgence when we foul up one way or the other, which is given over 90 minutes we bound to be imperfect. About your introduction, David, I would, with your permission, like to say that while I appreciate your introduction very much, I'm not sure that I'm worthy of any, much less all of that. Perhaps the audience knows what Abraham Lincoln was fond of saying when he received a much appreciated, but he thought perhaps overly generous introduction. That Honest Abe said, "Never take time to deny it. The audience will find out the truth soon enough for themselves." And so it will be with our audience tonight.
Well, thank you so much. I know we have a beautiful partner library in Austin, Texas as well. So, I like to think these days of the newsroom and libraries in some ways being the two keepers of public information. And sometimes we do a good job, and sometimes we have room for improvement.
That's so true. Well, I always, perhaps we can talk about it as we go along, but I do want to say right at the start, David, that of course I'm familiar with the library in which you sit, and that I'm a Texan by birth and by choice. I'm 6th generation Texan, not only from Texas, but of Texas. But I know Boston and know Boston fairly well, and I know this, that the library in which you now sit and which has undergone a tremendous change for the better to keep up with times in recent years. I think people in Boston know it and think of it as a treasure for Boston, and perhaps a treasure for the state of Massachusetts. But it is a national treasure, and I don't think it's too much to say a world treasure. not only for what it is, but for what it has stood over the years. And that's an added reason why I'm honored and feel privileged to be with you tonight.
Well, thank you for those opening words. These are trying times. I think we would be remiss in not beginning with some thoughts around some of the challenges we face as cities, as a nation, and indeed as a species. With your permission, I'd like to turn first to probably one of the most troubling issues that we're dealing with, and that is the killing of George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man in Minneapolis. I'd like to ask you for your take on this situation and the resulting protests and demonstrations that have occurred.
Well, thank you, David. It's a big subject, and obviously we could spend the rest of the 90 minutes that we have here on this subject. It'll be a relief to the audience, I think, to know we will not spend all that time on it. But I do think it's right to begin, because this is an important point in what you have described as the arc of history. I sometimes call it the river of history. The first and foremost thing is we need to recognize that this is an important moment. It's a critical moment, a crucial moment for our country and everything that we've tried to make our country stand for over the years. One reason for that is it's such a powerful and dangerous combination. What we have is a health crisis, the likes of which we've not seen since the 1918 pandemic, the great Spanish flu epidemic, which partially brought on an economic crisis, the likes of which we have not seen probably since 1933 and the Great Depression. And then the civil uprising over the death in Minneapolis has brought to the forefront civil demonstrations of a sort and a nature which we've not seen on this scale since at least 1968. Together with it, what makes this even more toxic, what adds to the toxicity and the danger of the situation is all of this: the health crisis, the economic crisis, the uprising of street demonstrations calling for justice are happening at the same time when two external factors are very much at play as well. That our country has been under a psych ops attack from Russia, a relentless psychological attack for some years now, and some others, including China, to at least some degree have been involved in that. While at the same time, we have the ongoing war. This is an actual war against Al-Qaeda and the forces of terrorism, the likes of which brought us to 9/11. So it takes time to say that. It takes time for us to process that. But we have to understand this is where we are. I do think it's important to point out specifically about what's been happening in the streets of cities large and small in the wake of the terrible situation in Minneapolis. But first of all, while there are some similarities of this with what we went through in 1968, it's different this time in this sense, and I say in no self-serving way. I covered many of, at least several, I would say numerous, of the riots that happened in 1968 in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. The difference this time is, first of all, the participants in the demonstrations we have seen are much more diverse. There's incredibly increased diversity, both in terms of race and ethnicity. The 1968 outburst and civil disobedience and riots were primarily race-based, somewhat mixed with anti-war sentiments, true. But nonetheless, now the diversity of this is really stunning and in some ways to me encouraging. You have generational diversity, uh, ethnic and racial diversity, I think is very, very encouraging. But this much we know, and that this is not just another time of some days or even weeks. This time, there has to be some change. And we know what kind of change. We don't need to list all of it, but beginning with, what do we do about reform of police? You know, I cut my teeth as a journalist, as a police beat reporter, and you never met anybody who has more respect for individual policemen and their commitment to public service. But we have to change the amount of diversity in our police forces, the way they are trained and the way they approach much of their work. That's just the beginning, because in the end, what it has to do is justice, of equal justice under the law.
The other dimension that I would want you to comment on is that certainly in Boston and the majority of the vast majority of the gatherings have been peaceful, have been vocal. There was one exception, which was a situation on Sunday night, but every other situation has been large gatherings. Again, the diversity that you speak of appears in evidence in terms of those marching, those protesting, those demonstrating, but predominantly young people as well, and not exclusively, but a lot of young people of all races, black, white, and other races. Does that feel different as well, or is that similar to what you saw before?
As part of when I said diversity, I included age in that.
Yeah, but
from what I can gather, obviously I don't have scientific information, but I feel confident in saying that there are many more young people involved in these demonstrations than was the case in 1968. Now, part of that may be because school is out so many places. In 1968, every school in the country was still open, although some of the riots happened during over spring break. But your point is well taken. There is a definite weighting in the direction of youth with what's happening now. I find that encouraging. I will admit to you that on some days, in many ways, it's difficult to be optimistic and encouraged about what has happened and what is happening. But one of the encouraging signs is what you put your finger on, is how many young people are out there and serious in what they're doing. And I also want to note, David, that you raised another good point, which is, and those of us in the media, and I include myself, have a lot to answer for in this way, that overwhelmingly, these demonstrations have been peaceful. Overwhelmingly so. Now, what dominates the television screens and the social media platforms, and for that matter, newspaper front pages and magazines, are fires, eruptions, breaking and looting, which definitely is a problem. But my point is, if we aren't careful, we will lead ourselves to believe and lead the world to believe that the United States of America is collapsing and coming apart at the seams. We have enormous problems, which I outlined, at least in touching base way, when we opened this conversation. And this is a difficult time, and nobody's underestimating it. But this is a big, two-ocean, very diverse country, over 300 million people. And we are not, at least not yet, I don't think anywhere near collapse or coming apart at the seams. We are at a point where we have to make changes. It's not an option, it's imperative.
And on the youth engagement piece, and I know you've been an advocate recently for greater civic engagement and voter registration and participation in democracy. We saw both in light of the Parkland shootings, the school shootings, and also with respect to the issue of climate change, it really is younger people who are taking up the cause and demanding change at a pace that I certainly have not seen before. Not to suggest that any of these issues are new issues. The race issues go back 400 years. This is not the first loss of life that we have seen. But across a number of issues, there are trends around youth engagement, which perhaps give us a glimmer of hope. Does that match your experience, and how does that relate to past movements that you've covered?
Well, the best past movement that I covered that one would use as an example was it was my responsibility for CBS News in the early 1960s to cover on a day-by-day, week-in, week-out basis Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and what turned out to be the sort of early parts of that movement. The absolute key to that movement was Dr. King's absolute dedication and determination insofar as he could to keep it nonviolent. And there were plenty of times in the years 1962, 63, which I basically was covering Dr. King, when there was plenty of reason to believe that the movement would fail. To make it succeed required the dedication and the absolute strong focus on the fundamentals of the movement, the greatest of which was nonviolent, but not only by Dr. King himself and a coterie of people who surrounded him and helped him, but the rank and file men, women, and children who followed Dr. King, who demonstrated in the streets, who stayed nonviolent even in the face of high-pressure fire hoses and fierce dogs and police brutality. Having a vision of what they wanted to accomplish and a determination to get there through nonviolence were keys to that movement. Now, there is no Dr. Martin Luther King, no single leader around whom this current uprising is now centered. But insofar as the movement will be successful in making some real fundamental change, I think it will be on the ability of the rank and file to emphasize and keep emphasizing why they are in the street, why they're demonstrating, which, as I read it, and I do think it would be the most effective thing for them, is to emphasize they want us to move closer to the American ideal of equal justice under the law, equal justice under the law. Of course, we can never reach perfection, but one focus of this uprising is I think they need to keep their focus on, we want to come closer to the ideal of equal justice under the law. And then beyond that is what it's about is a reverence for life. And if the movement is to keep itself coalesced around those two messages, I do think we will see some rather dramatic change. But on the other hand, David, keep in mind that I'm an optimist by nature and by experience, and sometimes I'm a little too optimistic.
Well, I think when we advocate for nonviolence, that doesn't mean that anger can't be part of the experience. It just needs a certain type of expression. And I appreciate very much that two white men can participate in this conversation around race, which is one of the conversations that really needs to be happening at this time. Obviously, I think as we move as a society to conversation around action, everybody needs to be part of the conversation, and in part it needs diverse leadership, and it needs to be a Black conversation. But the fact that we can have this as part of that, I think, is an important note. So thank you for indulging me in that conversation. The role of journalism in this is also important. You touched on one challenge, the opportunity to ensure the focus is on the right parts and not exclusively on eye-catching headlines or the gloom and doom aspect or the tragic parts, for sure. We've also seen journalists being arrested or attacked in reporting on some of the racial demonstrations, and that seems to me to be another aspect of what we're seeing as disturbing. Was that ever part of other demonstration periods that you were aware of,
Yes.
where journalists themselves came under attack?
Yes, very much so, and particularly in those early and even late Dr. King civil rights movements, there was a lot of violence against journalists during that time. And I do want to respond to your question, but with your indulgence, David, let me hark back to something that you said before you asked the question about journalists. And that is that we recognize, and I think it's very important to say so, and I appreciate your saying so, that we are two white men having a conversation about, among other things, the deep and abiding racism in the country. It always almost sticks in my throat to say deep and abiding racism in the country, but that's the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
And speaking for myself, and I do think it's important, particularly those of us in journalism and among people in leadership in any profession or craft, particularly for white people, it's important to listen. This is the time to listen. You get, especially when speaking of race, it's time for, and I don't want to be preachy here, but it's time for humility and some gratitude for the privilege that we as whites acknowledge that we are privileged, but to listen. We need to listen to what people of color in general have to say, but particularly African Americans in this moment. We can listen to what they have to say and be seen listening, I think is of critical importance. And one of the things that bothers me the most is there are exceptions, but with the very top leadership of the country, one doesn't get the impression that they're doing much, if any, listening. And I despair over that, and I also think it's dangerous for the country. Now to your point about violence against the press. Obviously, this is something I feel very strongly about, but I will say gently and with some humility. Humility is not a word generally associated with anchor people, present or past, but I will say with some humility that this is something, it's not just an issue for the press. This is something for the country as a whole to take into serious consideration. The number of times that there has been violence against journalists while covering these most recent demonstrations in the streets has passed over 100. This is 100 documented times of where violence has been propagated against journalists. Not all of it police violence. But I think this is unprecedented, the scale of it. When I was covering Dr. King in the early 1960s, it was common for journalists, yes, including myself, and including CBS News teams that I worked with when we were covering Dr. King in the South, to face violence and threats of violence. There were reporters beaten. This, generally speaking, was the violence against journalists came from two sources at that time. One were people who were violently opposed to what Dr. King and his followers stood for, and they saw journalism coverage of that as a threat to their status quo. And then that extended to a large degree, I'm sorry to say, to police forces. And the political leadership encouraged it. But, for example, in 1962 and 63, CBS News in the South, partly because we were leading in the coverage of racial violence, we were generally called the colored broadcasting system, as in CBS, or the communist broadcasting system. These phrases were used by community leaders and in some cases elected leaders of counties and the state. And this, of course, encouraged violence. Now we move to today that these attacks on the press are unprecedented in the number of attacks that have happened. I recognize that in some cases, the police will argue, and perhaps in some cases will argue justifiably and legitimately that they didn't mean to do it, or it was an accident. But by and large, most of it is not accidental. Whether it's police violence against the press or people who are part of the uprising violence. But I do come back to the point that the public needs to understand that these are attacks on the public's right to know what's going on. And that's a greater concern than any individual attack on any individual journalist.
It does seem that there are challenges for journalism, news reporting that are new and different than maybe the 90s, which I want to come to in a moment because I have a little personal question to ask you on that. But as we're on this topic of, when did this change start to happen? This apparent shift from trust in news reporting. And no one's perfect, and we can talk about that as well in terms of reporting, but the intent of reporting facts and distinguishing between facts and opinion and editorial, the editorial role versus the reporting role. It seems that has had a shift. What's your first sense of noticing when that shift was really in evidence? Or was it always there and was just in a different forum?
I can't say that I think it's been always there, but in a different form. Yeah. It's certainly true that every president has had at least some moments in which he's thought the press was treating him, and they have all been then, of course, unfairly. But we're talking about a public mood that overall, I first began to notice it in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And I think partly because of two factors. One, the civil rights movement, which began first small, but then began to take traction. As the civil rights movement began to take traction, and in the wake of President Kennedy's assassination, in which various conspiracy theories began to be much more popular than they had been before the presidency. A combination of those two things in the 1960s was the first time that I noticed, and keep in mind that, I'm now 88 years old, but when I first started covering Dr. King, I had just turned 30, and through the early 60s, I was in my early 30s. What I began to notice is that increasingly political leaders on the right side, quote, unquote, right side of the political spectrum, begin to blame for the unrest in the country and such things as the increasingly obvious failure in Vietnam, to blame the messengers, not the fact of the case. It was a version of saying, this is when I first noticed in the 60s. First, a few political leaders and then more political leaders began to argue, our problems, our national problems, our problems are not the problem. The problem is the people who call attention to the problem. Mm. These damn press people, these color broadcasting system, these communist broadcasting system people. They keep saying, people are being beaten and killed for trying to exercise their rights because they're black people. And that's a problem, folks. The political leadership saying, look, it's not really a problem. It's these damn reporters calling attention to the problem. And in Vietnam, reporters saying, Washington keeps saying there are great victories here. We as reporters are out in the jungle, in the countryside, and let me tell you, the sergeants and captains will tell you that's not the case. So the political leadership was saying, well, you see, it's these damn reporters. The problem in Vietnam is not the problem that we're not doing very well, it's the people calling attention to it. That's the first time I noticed it. And it began to build on itself during the Nixon years. And then I would say in the Reagan administration, 1980 to 88, took another vault forward. And then once we got to the internet age, right, it really took off.
And I think maybe to build on the internet age and the start of that, there's an aspect of the commercialization of news and media and the internet that seems to see another shift in who the newsrooms become accountable to. And I don't know who coined the phrase first, but you get edutainment, or you get this blend of entertainment and news media starting to emerge, and it becomes, I'm sure, more and more difficult to follow a story, really take the balanced facts, and take the time and effort to completely cover some of those issues. So I'm just wondering if that's if you would concur with that, or if you think
Definitely
it was.
concur with it, and I'm glad you raised it, David, because I find so many people, and I mean this gently, so many people don't understand this, that roughly until the late 1970s, that news was seen, generally speaking, as yes, it could make a profit, it could make money. But the people who owned news operations, and this included, I know, especially the owners of television stations and networks, they viewed news themselves, and they wanted the public to view news as, to no small degree, a public service. Their attitude, the owners of newspapers, and by the way, there were many more competing newspapers in there now, it was, yes, we'd like to make a profit, and we hope it was a profit, but we view this as a public service. And in the case of television, the founders of the networks were still the owners of the networks. And their attitude about news is, yes, if we make a profit, it's fine, but basically we view it as a public service. Now, that began to change, as say, in the late 70s, when some few places, particularly in television, began to realize, you know what, there's even more money to be made in news than people realize. And particularly if the news can be mixed with more entertaining. In the 1980s, and I'm trying to keep this as simple as I can and as short as I can, the Federal Communications Commission changed the rules, which had encouraged viewing news as a public service rather than just a money-making operation. When they changed the rules, then the floodgates opened to the following things. More and more news programs in which the owners said, you know what, to hell with this idea of public service. I want to see the ratings, because the ratings equal more money, and you get more ratings by maybe mixing in entertainment, and the stronger you can mix in the entertainment, the better it is. The line began to bend and even break during the 80s, and then in the late 80s, when the ownership began changing, we had what media consolidation, that is, the big networks and big journalism enterprises sought to get bigger by buying others. And you had change in ownership. And with that change in ownership, almost every network changed ownership. All the major networks changed ownership in the 80s. With those changes of ownership, the old ownership, those people who had founded those networks and saw news as a public service disappeared. And with the new companies, they were always interested in increasing with each sale, the interest in getting the ratings up, getting the profits up, and not hearing anything about public service. The best example, and I'll close out here, say that there was a time until even the late 1980s when each of the three major networks would at least occasionally run in prime time, that's 8 to 11 p.m., a news documentary along the lines of, what about defense of the United States? Or should we not be in Afghanistan? Mm-hmm. What are the roots of current racial problems? Those kind of documentaries. In effect, they would say, we're going to put them on at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. We hope people will watch, but if they don't, we're not worried about it. Today, in 2020, I'm sorry to say, David, if you walked into Mahogany Row, that's what the news types always call the corporate types, Mahogany Row, and said, we need to do a 1-hour primetime program on what do we do in Afghanistan, our longest war, running on 18, 19 years now. One of two things would happen to you, and I don't mean this as a joke. You would either be accused of beginning to lose it in your head, or you'd be accused of smoking something very expensive, which is to say, nobody would listen to this kind of talk. That's a tremendous difference in what was the case in the 70s, as late as the 70s and 80s.
I mean, I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit to your biography, and this is actually continuous with that point. I first moved to Boston in the early 90s, and when one moves to a new place and wants to learn the culture, one of the access points is about, well, who's telling us the news and what's that about? And I have vivid memories of wondering who these mostly guys at first, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, a little of Ted Koppel, and Dan Ratherware, and so I'm interested to hear a little bit about your taking over from Walter Cronkite, and then was this competitive, or was this colleagues who were competing for ratings? What was all of that period like for you?
Well, the period began for me in 1981 when I succeeded Walter Cronkite as anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News. And please note that I said succeeded. No one replaces an icon like a Walter Cronkite. And at that time, what had been primarily a 2-network news race between NBC and CBS was rapidly becoming a 3-way competition, because ABC, under the late Lou Norridge, was coming on strong in news. So when I came to the anchor chair in 1981, the game, if you will, was changing from a 2-major team league to a 3-major team league, with ABC coming on very strong. And fairly quickly after CBS changed from Cronkite to Rather, and NBC changed from John Chancellor to Tom Brokaw. Right. And ABC, after experimenting with several forms, went to Peter Jennings. Mm-hmm. By the mid-1980s, it was a fiercely competitive 3-network news race. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, and probably having very little to do with me personally, CBS News led at that time and had in the early 80s, as it had for a long time. But it was very competitive. And there's no joy in saying this, David, but since you asked, that we were basically 3 still fairly young men, at least in our own mind. We were sort of, full of ourselves, always running the risk of hubris, and yes, fiercely competitive. And competitive to the point that, we had that false belief that in order to prevail, you had to dislike the other guy. Yeah. But fairly, over the years, first there came respect. Each of the 3, Brokaw, Jennings, and myself, would increasingly say to themselves, you know what, Peter did a good job tonight. Or that was a hell of a thing for Brokaw to do, a good thing. So first there came some respect. First there was, listen, I hate their guts, and they hate mine. And I know that they would slit my throat and throw my liver to the dogs if they could. And I feel the same way about them. But then slowly it got to be respect. And after a while, let's face it, each of us did the job for more than 12 or 15 years. In my case, I did it for 24 years. But later on, by the time we got to the late 1980s, respect had given way to real fondness. And I'm happy to say that both Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw became friends of mine, real friends. And God rest Peter's soul, he passed on some time away. But Tom Brokaw and I are still good friends. But part of that was that we faced similar challenges. the network would get sold to a new owner, and the new owner might not, well, wasn't as interested in keeping the integrity of the news division as the previous owner. We all went through that in one form or another. So that's the way that played out.
The other dimension that strikes me is at some point you all become or became, whether you knew it or not, keepers of public trust in delivering the news, and that would be in the spirit of the Cronkite era for sure. Personally, when did you realize that was part of the job, or did that come later?
No, from the very first moment.
Yeah.
Because keep in mind, David, that the CBS News in which I basically grew up, the CBS News in the 60s, 70s, and on into much, if not all, of the 80s, was a great American institution. Again, I want to make it clear, not because of anything I particularly did, but CBS News was special with all regards to NBC and ABC. That an atmosphere had been created at CBS News where we were led to believe that CBS News was a kind of magical, mystical news kingdom in which every correspondent was a knight fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. Right. And right down to the people who cleaned the building and worked in the cafeteria. That spirit permeated CBS News. It was a great place for journalists to work. Now, not because it was true that it was any magical, mystical kingdom, but this is the point. Because we believed it, we were better. We were better than we had any right to believe we could be. And so the question about, I recognize in succeeding Walter Cronkite that this was the professional challenge of my life. And I received a lot of advice from people who were friendly to me, and indeed people who loved me. A version of, Dan, don't take this job, because the first person after Cronkite is professionally going to get his head blown off. There's no way anybody can succeed in following Walter Cronkite. And that's a powerful argument with some precedent, whatever. But I came to it recognizing that, a public journal is a public trust. This was very popular, was often said at CBS News, that what we have at CBS News in this, quote, magical, mystical kingdom is the public trust. And we want to try as hard as we can to live up to that trust. And I came to the chair with that sense. I know that NBC had a version of this, and that Tom Brokaw came in the same way. And Peter Jennings, who represented a younger ABC News, not as deep in history or experience, but he felt the same way. This was, as the company was sold, each company in turn was sold, it was harder and harder to get the corporate executives of whoever bought the network at any given time to recognize that we felt strongly about that role.
Did the corporate owners, did that have influence over the newsroom? Because I know in certainly the print media, the owner and the publisher, all tried to have firewalls between each other about content. Was there something similar in the broadcast world?
Yes, there was, at least at CBS News, okay, where I spent 44 years. But at CBS News, in the years until William S. Paley, who founded the network, until he left, that is, sold the network in 1987, right in that area, that he and the late, great Edward R. Morrow had established in the very early days of electronic journalism this idea of a firewall. Right. That Paley, as owner of the company, and that the corporate side was to have nothing to say about the content of the news division's coverage. And widely believed it may not be, but true it is, that with only one exception that I know of in the 44 years I was at CBS News, and many of those under William S. Paley, the founder, There was only one time when Mr. Paley tried to break through that wall. That was in the height of Watergate, when Richard Nixon, who had been a friend of his, whom he had supported, and who had repeatedly tried to get to influence coverage in the news division, including having me removed as White House correspondent, Paley held the line. But right near the end, when the widespread criminal conspiracy led by the President of the United States himself, which we call under the rubric of Watergate, was really beginning to close in. President Nixon's and his the people who worked around him put tremendous pressure on Mr. Paley. And for the only time I know of, he tried to exert some pressure to get a report about Watergate, not to do it. But we digress. The answer is that I would say until the mid to late 1980s, and when the media consolidation began, this idea of a firewall pretty much held.
It seems like a far cry from the 24-hour news cycle of today, which is another characteristic of today's broadcast journalism and journalism in general. Are there pros or cons to the 24-hour news cycle that say, well, actually that's a good thing, but there's a drive to continuous coverage and content that doesn't lend itself to what we're talking about from the 80s and 90s in particular?
Well, the latter is very much true, that the 24-hour constant news cycle changed a great deal of American journalism, and you certainly can make an argument that some of the changes, maybe many of the changes were better. But the downside includes the following: that before you had the 24-hour constant on-the-air news cycle, most newspaper reporters had a deadline once a day. Deadline was 4:30 in the afternoon. Most television correspondents had deadline once a day. That would be for the evening news at 6:30. Maybe in the morning news and maybe for radio. But here's the thing, with the 24-hour constant news cycle, there's a deadline every nanosecond, particularly once social media and the internet came into play. That the average reporter, even at the best of journalistic institutions, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I would still argue the three major networks, CNN, your average reporter, he's expected to report 2 or 3 different stories during the day, to do a blog, maybe to do a podcast, to answer the rockets from the home office, can you match our competition on this story? That the burden to produce, as I say, with a deadline every nanosecond, doesn't leave nearly as much time for actual reporting, shoe-level reporting, walking out to talk to people, making telephone calls. Right. And therefore, there has been I'm sorry to say, an overall lowering of standards for both accuracy and ethics. It's more dramatic in some places than others, but those of us in journalism we don't do ourselves any favor when we refuse to acknowledge that fact.
Great. Before we get to a ton of questions that have been lined up by our participants, those who submitted them during registration and who are submitting them today, I do want to give you one opportunity to talk about some of the amazing interviews that you have done over the years. I'm sure there are some highlights. I'm sure there are quite a lot of individuals in different roles, and that's even before I get to the musicians and entertainment folks that you've spent a lot of time on in the last few years. But are there a couple of really amazing interviews that you'd like to mention? The one that strikes me as being completely unexpected was the Saddam Hussein interview. But please feel free to check to select whichever ones you'd like to talk to us about.
Well, I appreciate you asking, David. And the first thing I want to say is I can be dumb as a fence post about a lot of things, but I'm at least smart enough to know how lucky and really blessed I've been as a journalist. to have been on, yes, more than my share of big stories, and yes, to have engaged in maybe more than my share of important interviews, not always with well-known people.
Mm.
But I'm going to give you a list of maybe three to five interviews that stand out in my mind. But I could choose another 3 to 5 quite easily. Covering Dr. Martin Luther King and talking to Dr. Martin Luther King on a one-on-one personal basis. Covering Dr. King changed me as a person and as a pro, having been raised in a segregated society such as Texas. And any time that I spoke with Dr. King became a very memorable time. There weren't that many times when he was actually sit down interview because, as you know, he was very skittish about the press. Anytime you interview a president of the United States, and I've talked to every man who's been president since President Truman, beginning with President Eisenhower. But anytime you talk to a president, it's a privilege, and I always viewed it as an honor, and always try to prepare and do my best, and each one is memorable. Speaking with Mother Teresa, I'm not Roman Catholic, but you don't have to be Catholic to, in her presence, recognize that you're in the presence of an extraordinary person. Nelson Mandela, whom I was lucky enough to interview in his home the night he was released from prison in South Africa. It was a never to be forgotten interview and a great life lesson in the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. The interview with Saddam Hussein, particularly, I interviewed him twice. Once just after he had invaded Kuwait in what we would call Gulf War I, and then the second time just before, within a day and a half or 2 days of the beginning of Gulf War II. The first interview with Saddam Hussein, in which I was taken to Baghdad Palace, down on the balance of the palace, and I was alone. I had no one with me. To do that interview under those circumstances at that time, well, I'm not going to overstate it, but I felt the pressure. And it was a tense situation, to say the least. I would say among the most challenging interviews that I've done, because first of all, I was totally by myself. Secondly, I'd been awake in the middle of the night. I wasn't feeling all that well, but I had rehearsed the interview for weeks, hoping against hope we'd get it out of our street. And I had 3 different columns of questioning. But when I sat with him across from eyeball to eyeball with him, I very quickly was mixing and matching those questions. So those are among the more memorable.
That's amazing. It's an interesting technique in terms of preparing for interviews as well. I think I'm taking some notes as you're speaking around those experiences. Is there a story that you regret not covering? Maybe one that you were offered and had to pass on for some reason? Or perhaps something that someone else covered that you were going, oh, I wish I'd been there, or I wish I'd had the opportunity to cover that?
Oh, well, there are all kinds of stories that you say to yourself, damn, I wish I were there for that. And particularly when you were in a very highly competitive environment, as I mentioned, we were as 3 anchors in the 80s, you were always mentally at least kicking the wall when the competition was on. But the question is a good one. I've had to think about that for a moment. Nothing really jumps to mind. When the terrible nuclear disaster hit Japan, when was that, a few years back? I found myself saying, I wish I were there to cover that story. They had this nuclear disaster, which is one of the great all-time terrible stories in Japan. I remember saying to myself, boy, I don't know, I really would like to get there on that story. But I think it's fair to say, David, that I've got a lot of faults and have made a lot of mistakes. But I have a passion for news reporting, and to use the cliche, to this day, it's a bit of the fire horse mentality. There's a bell rings, you want to go, you want to be there. I'll give you a recent example that until the pandemic hit, I had what many of the people who work with me considered a wild idea, but I wanted to go back to Afghanistan. I've been to Afghanistan beginning with a trip in 1980, just after the Russians invaded, maybe 16 times over the year. But I thought, well, I'll go back one last time this year, although I had to weigh the fact, well, is it madness for an 88-year-old man to think he's going to go in a combat zone and all those questions? But that's an example of, once you have it in your blood, I don't think it ever goes out. It hasn't in mind.
It strikes me that part of the beauty of some of the interviewees that you've cited is their amazing leadership qualities. And I just wonder if there are themes that you think the current moment calls for in terms of true leadership, either on the national stage or on the global stage. What are those characteristics that come to mind that the current moment truly calls for?
Well, the current moment truly calls for, as many moments in the past in both American and world history have called for. Current moment calls for leaders, and particularly a national leadership that can develop a high degree of communicable trust between the leadership and the led. But particularly in developed, industrialized Western countries, there's no substitute for having this ability to communicate trust, to engender trust between the leadership and the led. The second thing, and these are in no particular order, is the ability to articulate a vision for the future. Most successful leaders, our historian friends may want to argue about this when it comes to history as a whole, but I think this holds up. It does for our own country. That part of engendering trust is to have a realistic optimism. Because let's face it, so much of the world depends on a high level of hope. So high degree of communicable trust, articulate a vision that leaves in it realistic optimism and hope are the marks of leadership. I would argue that in terms of having a vision for what you want to accomplish, I do think ancient history as well as modern history supports the view that successful leaders have a vision and an ability to articulate that vision and to inspire people to move with them toward that vision. Whether it's Moses or Alexander,
sure.
It's here's where we want to go, folks. Maybe a different metaphor is I'm throwing out a polar star, and we must always be moving toward that navigational polar star. For example, in today's context of what's happening in the streets, a leader can say, our polar star is equal justice under the law. We're never going to reach it completely, but we are going to start today moving inexorably closer and closer to the polar star, to the navigation star. That's a mark of real leadership.
Without getting into the current political scene in the U.S., are there leaders on the world stage that you are keeping a particular eye on to see? Oh, that person has some of that characteristic. I want to see what they're going to do next.
Well, number one on the list, and it's hard to draw a line to it, is what happens with the leadership of China.
Yeah.
As you know, it's a country dedicated to the idea of leadership by party leadership. But that manifests itself, at least in some ways, around one person. And the directions China goes in going forward will have much to do with how much of any peace we have in the 21st century. So certainly there. The leadership in Germany, the lady, I suppose it marks yesterday's man by saying the lady, but Ms. Merkel, has exhibited remarkable leadership in Germany. Not that it's been perfect, it hasn't been perfect, but everything from her leadership through the pandemic to navigating the rough economic waters, very impressive.
In a similar vein, because I think what we've touched on is there are good leaders, but we need good journalists to cover them. Are there particular journalists that you look to because you value their particular ability to capture a story or guide the public or guide the viewers? Like who is the next generation of these trusted anchors, trusted journalists that you see?
Well, David, I've been waiting for you to drop that on me. Thank you, what I always do. The answer is yes, there are quite a few of them. I really am very much encouraged by what I see, both in terms of people who are on television, particularly some of the more experienced people, but also some of the younger talent coming up, very impressive. The newspapers, some of the newspapers under the most difficult financial circumstances, particularly the Times and the Washington Post, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, have done some amazing reporting. Now, to your question, I'm not going to single out any one person because I've to my horror, when I've tried this before, if I name one person, then 12 people call me and say, "What the hell, you didn't mention my name." If I mention 12 people, another 12 people will call. But suffice to say that I think journalism has had something of a renaissance in the last 3 to 5 years, particularly in the area of deep digging investigative reporting. There was a time in the late 1990s and early 2000s when I thought investigative reporting is a dying art. Nobody wants to finance it, but we've had some really amazing investigative reporting, and I think the Post and the New York Times and others that have done that kind of reporting need to be encouraged. Mark it down that when I ask for specific names of people I know, that I ducked and I dodged.
I might ask you later after we're done, but I respect the balance that you're striking with that answer for sure. Are there questions? Just returning to political leadership for a second. Are there questions that you would ask either our last president? Didn't have time to check whether you interviewed Barack Obama. Are there questions you would ask him? Are there questions that you would ask Donald Trump?
I did interview Barack Obama. I've interviewed Donald Trump several times, not since he has been president, but before he was president. Well, as for President Trump, I think a core question, one thing about doing interviews, you said you keeping notes in interviews. The key to any interview is preparation, and then listening during the interview. So I think in an interview with President Trump, it would be even more important than it usually is to listen carefully to his answers and to follow up and keep following up with him, because he specializes in interviews in which he shifts off the question to answer the question he wants to be. So I think it's very important to keep in mind in an interview with President Trump to keep asking, if necessary, the same question until he answers it, or it's very clear he's ducking the answer. But one question with President Trump, and I do think I want to play the game with you here, if you will, but to ask him, of what is he afraid? He's obviously afraid of something deep within him. Afraid. If we know enough about human nature, the way people behave. People don't behave the way he does.
Mm.
Unless they have some great fear of something that's being exposed. So it's, dear Mr. President, speak candidly, of what are you afraid?
Mm.
What's your principal latest fear? I think could be a telling question. With President Barack Obama, I'm pausing because basically I want to say to him, you know, the further we get away from your presidency, the more we come to recognize how many things you did right. Not that you did everything right, and I have a long list, Mr. President, of questions about things that you didn't do right. For example, drawing a line with Syria and then backing off the line, as one example. But it is true that, you know, every day that passes, I think, almost regardless of your political persuasions, you have to say, he's looking ever better as compared to what we have now.
I have a question here from a young student that I do want to read to you. This is a student journalist from Needham, Massachusetts, who has been a reporter since he was quite young, probably in his teen years. Went to the White House as a member of the Scholastic News Kids Press Corps. And that gave him the opportunity to interview First Lady Michelle Obama at the time, former Vice President Joe Biden, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and journalist Anderson Cooper. That's quite a little accomplishment list here. His question, and this is from Max, I want Mr. Rather to know how much journalism means to me. I know that I can learn a lot from him about using my writing and reporting platform as part of civic action. What are your thoughts on parallels between youth activism during the civil rights movement and today?
Well, Max, that's a very good question. First of all, I think more young people at earlier ages are involved in forms of activism today than was the case in the 1960s, even at the height of the civil rights movement that was built around Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm not sure, that's number one. Part of this, I mentioned before, may be because in this particular moment, by and large, school is not in session, so young people have more time and opportunity to do so. But I think it runs deeper than that. If I understand the core of your question about activism and journalism, I think it's very important, Max, and heavens knows again, I want you to understand that I haven't done it perfectly, far from it. I've made a lot of mistakes. I have wounds, some self-inflicted. But in journalism, it's important to keep in mind as you think of yourself, you want to think of yourself as an activist. But as a journalist, the best way to harness that thought is to say to yourself some version of, let me repeat to myself why I am in journalism. And I'm in journalism to be an honest broker of information. I'm trying to get as close to the truth as humanly possible and tell it. As a journalist, that's your activism. If that makes any sense to you, then I can understand how it might not. But I do find, particularly with young journalists, and thinking back on it when I was a young journalist, which has been a very long time ago, it's important to say to yourself, why did I get into journalism? Why am I here? What is it I'm trying to do? So you can first remind yourself from time to time, and then remind others within you to do. Thank you, Max.
Yeah, I'm interested in tying that to your earlier point about seeing a renaissance in journalism more broadly at the moment. We have similar questions from Melissa and Claudia about what do we need to do to protect the future of journalism? Maybe there's two sides to that, that if there's a resurgence, we need to support that and nurture it rather than protect it. But there may be things that we need to do to protect it as well. Dan, your thoughts on those questions?
Well, again, good questions. Melissa and who was the other?
Claudia.
Melissa and Claudia, good questions. Well, I think it begins, and this is something I feel fairly strongly about. I do think we need to re-emphasize as a very important part of education in this country, the teaching of what used to be called civics. Mm-hmm. Civics used to be a requirement no later than 7th or 8th grade. And included in every civics class was the importance of first the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, beginning with the First Amendment. There's been a diminution and almost an elimination of teaching of civics. And within that, the teaching of what the First Amendment to the Constitution is and why it's important to every American, not just oppressed people, I think would be a good place to start to build on what I do think is a bit of a renaissance in the press. But now with the press under unrelenting attack from this particular president himself and the whole, much of the apparatus of the federal government, at a time when the press is under that attack, and very timely at a time when reporters are being attacked in the streets as a byproduct of these massive public demonstrations. What a good time to remind ourselves that it's in the public interest, the overall public interest, to know the importance of the freedom of the press. And as I say, I haven't started a crusade, but I'd like to start a crusade for the reintroduction of teaching physics, civics. Physics is good for us too, but civics in every school in the country.
This ties into a question asked by Heidi, which is also on education, but specifically, do you have advice for educators about how to share lessons from history while focusing on hope, and I would assume on engagement? So not essentially trying to teach history as a living, dynamic topic, rather than something that's simply facts from the past.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the person to ask for advice on anything, much less how to teach, but I want to be responsive to the question. What has worked for me since a very early age is learning history, not exclusively, but primarily learning history through biography. And but little experience I've had in trying to teach, among others, my children and grandchildren, and occasionally teach other classes. I find that if you can almost literally bring to life individuals who stand out in history, religious and otherwise, that this is a great way to get students interested and keep them interested in history. I'm going to make an admission, which I suspect that teachers listening to this they'll wince a little bit. I was taught history also at a time when you memorize dates. Norman Conquest, 1066. Right. Magna Carta signed 1215. Columbus discovers the New World, 1492. Martin Luther makes his stand in 1517, enunciates it in Worms in 1521, and so forth, that kind of thing. And that has helped me over the years. I'm told almost unanimously by history teachers today, they don't like to teach it that way, and they don't think that's a good way to teach it. I can only give my personal testimony. Insofar as anything worked, it worked for me. But I go back to, I do think teaching history through biography is very effective.
And perhaps we should add media education or media literacy to the civics subject matter. which perhaps would help the next generation tell some of the facts from opinion, or fake news from real news, just to expand upon the engagement.
That's a very good point. And yes, I do think of it in civics classes. But let me say, and I recognize we don't have much time left here, and I do want to get to other questions.
Yep.
But even without the teaching of civics classes and how to watch the news, how to approach the news, I'm a little discouraged because I don't find enough people who understand that the basic question to ask, whether you're watching television or reading a newspaper or reading social media, is to say to oneself, who is this? Who is this person or persons doing the reporting? That's a very important question. And then, is this person trying to do, of the following things, what one thing are they trying to do, or is it a combination? One is what I will call straight news, just the facts. I'm a reporter. I'm establishing the facts, is giving the facts. Number two is what I would call fact-based analysis. We all know you can draw all the facts and still not know the truth. You have to connect the dots metaphorically. So is this a straight news report where it's just the facts, ma'am, or is it the facts plus connecting the facts with analysis to trying to get a little closer to the truth? Then there is commentary. And that's the person is just telling you what's going through their head. I do some of this myself now. In fact, a great deal of what I do on social media is designed to do this. Saying, look, folks, I've been a few places, I've seen a few things. I think maybe I can help you put things into historical context and perspective. So let me just comment on the news. That's commentary. We have three things: straight news, analysis, commentary. Then there is editorial. An editorial, the difference between an editorial and commentary, an editorial urges a course of action. An editorial is vote for X over Y, or believe candidate X and don't believe candidate Y, or pass the bond issue. That's an editorial. So it's very important to have in your head as a news consumer, from whom am I getting this? What are their qualifications? And how do they see themselves? Sometimes people blend some version of all four of those, but at least it will help you to kind of sort out in your own mind who should be considered a legitimate journalist and who shouldn't.
There's a question from Frederick, which is asking about a particular skill that apparently you have, which I'd like to just put to you. Can you ask Mr. Rather to tell us about the unusual skill he developed for using two different earphones at once while on the air?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I will answer the question, but I want to make sure that every experienced anchor person has their own ways of dealing with certain situations on the air. Now, the ultimate test for a network anchor person is when you take air and there is no script. There's nothing in the teleprompter, there's nothing in your hand. For example, an extreme example would be 9/11. A less extreme example would be the oncoming and the hit of, say, a tremendous hurricane. You jump in the seat, the red light goes on, and it's your job to keep your network news operation on the air and build coverage as it goes. Election night is another such time. On election night, sometimes you're going to be on the air from 5 o'clock in the afternoon around 8 or 9 o'clock the next morning. Now, as anchor, in my own case, I wore an earpiece in each ear, one on each side. One earpiece went to the control room. The control room is where there's a director who's controlling what's going to come up in the way of video and audio on screen. And the other ear went to the editorial desk. And that is the place where information flows. When people write a script for you or pass you a note, they're double checking information. Now, election night would be a good example. The camera's in front of you, you're talking to the camera, you're telling people, stay tuned for coming up in a few minutes, we have returns from North Dakota. While the director may be saying in your ear, don't say it now, but we're going to go to pictures of the North Dakota Capitol in 2 minutes. At the same time, somebody from the editorial desk is saying to you, the news is not going to be good for Democrats in North Dakota. Frankly, when I first started telling people about this, I was a little surprised. People say, how the hell do you do that? It's not a great skill. It's not a great talent at all. It just comes from years of being on the air. It's a little hard to explain, but you can train your brain to handle what the director is saying in this ear, what the editorial desk is saying in this ear, and at the same time keep a line of chatter going with the camera to straighten out.
Well, as someone who watched a lot, you made it look so easy. So at this point, I think we have time for one more question. And we certainly did not get to all of the questions by any means, but we appreciate everybody's submissions. We managed to touch on a few, even if we didn't ask them directly as written. But who's left, or rather, I don't like that question, but that phrasing. Who's next on your interview to-do list? Who are the people that you still want to get to?
Well, I'd love to interview the so-called Supreme Leader of North Korea. Mm. I have been to North Korea, and I sat within about 14, 16 feet of him, but that was as close as I've got, and I never got the interviewer. Regardless of what he had to say or how much he had to say, yeah, that'd be a scoop, that would be a beat, that would be a big get. I'd love to do that. I have interviewed President Putin in Russia, but not lately. That would be a very big get. Would I like to interview President Trump? Yes. Do I think it's likely to happen? Probably not. You've been wonderful to me, David, and I recognize we're at or near the end here. And if you can indulge me, I told this story once before in Boston not too long ago, but you'd asked about Walter Cronkite earlier. And when you're finally ready to wind up, if you'll indulge me telling a short story, I think our friends who have been kind enough to come tonight can at least go away and say, well, we had one period of pretty good humor.
Please go right ahead.
Well, this is, Walter Cronkite lived to be, he lived a good long life, well into his 90s. He had, from the time he was sometime in the mid-80s, he had some hearing problems, which I can relate to because I lost 40% of my hearing in Vietnam, and age is taking care of the rest. But his wife, Betsy, his late Walter's wife, Betsy, told a story which I loved. I wouldn't tell it if it weren't the fact that Betsy had told the story in public a number of times, because my respect for Walter Cronkite remains deep and abiding. But she told the story of, they like to sail, and they like to sail off Martha's Vineyard. And they frequently had people to sail with them. She describes one Saturday when she said quietly to Walter, we need to go in, we need to take the dinghy and go in and resupply a little bit. So they quietly took the dinghy off their sailing ship, left their guests on the ship, went to their favorite store, but it was Saturday afternoon, so the store was more crowded than it normally would be during the week. And everybody, of course, recognized Walter and wanted to say hello. And Walter was great with people. People come up and say, I've been listening to you since I was knee-high to a pup. And do you remember this? Do you remember so-and-so? And Walter always stopped and had a word with people. So it took forever to get to the cash register. And Mrs. Cronkite said she was pretty much saying to Walter, you got to move on, Get the cash register, finally get the cash register. She thinks it's over, but one gentleman sort of comes out of the shadows and suddenly says to Walter, Walter, do you know so-and-so and so-and-so? And of course, Walter raised up to his full height and said, I can't say that I know him, but I have met him, and he's a wonderful fellow. Thank you very much.
Jan, it's been a tremendous pleasure. Thank you so much for indulging us in this experiment.
Oh, I'm sorry, David. This is the first time with this person we had trouble. But after that, when they got outside,
Oh, it was
Mrs. Cronkite said, Walter, you have to be more careful of what you say to people. That man asked you, do you know Jesus?
and there's the punchline.
David, it's a pleasure being with you.
Again, thank you so much. You've been a great guest, and thank you for indulging us in our experiment. I would also like to thank all of you for joining us. Thanks to the WGBH Network, Forum Network, and the Lowell Institute who helped sponsor this series and this program. Thank you, and good night.